I met Mel Brooks through a friend of mine from back east who came out before I did to California and became a writer. And it's Barry Levinson. And Barry Levinson was a good friend of my wife's and a good friend of mine. And he came out to L.A., started out as a stand-up comedian, and then wound up teaming up with a couple of writers, with one writer, then another writer, and then getting onto television shows. He wrote for a show called The Loman and Barkley Show, and then for Carol Burnett Show. That was the big break for him. He wound up being one of the staff writers on the Carol Burnett Show. And when Mel Brooks was looking for writers to work with, he hired Barry and Barry's partners to work with. So at this point, I had just gotten to California. I was working as an AD for Lorimar Television. I had done the Blue Night series, which was George Kennedy was the lead actor, and it was called the Blue Night series. And then I did Eight Is Enough. I became a production manager on Eight Is Enough, and I did that for just the first 6 episodes. And one day, I got a call, and it was Mel Brooks. And I knew Mel Brooks from his comedy routines. His voice, I couldn't really believe it. And he said, "Hi, it's Mel Brooks. Barry told me about you, and I'm looking for an AD, and I'm doing this movie called High Anxiety, and I'd like to know if you'd be interested in coming in and meeting with me." So I said, "Yeah, sure, I'd love to." So I went over to 20th Century Fox. I had a meeting with Mel. He said, "Look, I've used the same AD for several years on Blazing Saddles and on Silent Movie, and he's now an executive at a studio, and I need somebody new. Barry thought you might be good, so would you be interested?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "Well, you're hired." I mean, it was just like that. I mean, he just said, "You're hired." Okay. He says, "Here's the script. Call me on, read it, and let's talk." Anyway, that was on a Friday. True story. That weekend, I went to Palm Springs. I had a relative who had a place in Palm Springs. And it was hot in Palm Springs, but it was I think it was in February, I don't remember. But up in the mountains above Palm Springs where the cable cars went, there was snow up there. So we were in our bathing suits and stuff like that. We said, "Oh, let's take," I was with my wife and 2 friends. And we wound up taking a cable car, and we went up there, and through a series of stupid mishaps and games we were playing in the snow, I fell down and broke my leg. So I had to be carried out, taken down, had my leg set in a hospital in Palm Springs, and driven home. So I get home, it's Monday morning, and I realize you can't make a movie as an AD if you can't walk. And I am not going to be able to walk for a while. My leg has to be set, and I have to have, I probably have to get around in a wheelchair for a while until I can get on crutches, because I can't put any weight on it at first. So I called Mel up and I said, "Look, Mel, I'm so sorry. It was great meeting you, and I really enjoyed the experience, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do the movie because I broke my leg." And he says, "You broke your leg? Where?" I said, "In Palm Springs." "In Palm Springs? How could you break your leg in Palm?" So I told, in the snow in Palm Springs. I said, so he says, "That's crazy." He says, "Geez, I'm real sorry. Boy, I really was looking forward to working with you, but I guess if you can't do it, you can't do it." That was it. Hung up. About 20 minutes later, he calls me up. He says, "Hey, Jonathan." I said, "Yeah." He said, "You think you could do it in a wheelchair?" And I said, I don't know. He said, "Well, I really liked you, and I want you to do this. And if you think you can do it in a wheelchair, I'm willing to take the chance, if you are." And in the meantime, I was doing my breakdown and strips, all those things that I told you about.
Still in the process.
I was in the I had started, because he gave me the script to do. So what I was doing when I had the time was just scheduling and stuff like that. So I said, yeah. I said, but I don't know how the studio is going to feel about this. This is Fox. So he says, well, let me worry about the studio. So I said, okay. I get a call back a couple hours later. It's from the head of physical production at Fox saying, hi, Jonathan, I heard, Mel called. I heard you broke your leg. Now, you can't really be an AD on a movie with a broken leg. I mean, it's, we like you very much, and, we're happy if you have you do this, but it's just not going to work. I just want you to know that. Mel thinks that it can happen, but we don't really think that this is possible. So I said, oh, okay, all right, well, that's that. And then, literally, there was a series of phone calls. I get a phone call back maybe 20 minutes later. Now it's Mel again. Mel says, listen, the studio just called me and told me that you can't do the picture because you have a broken leg. He says, I don't like when people tell me what I can and can't do. I'm the director of this movie, and if you think you can do it, I want you to do it. And I'm going to fight them if you're okay with that. And I was brand new from New York. I was not ensconced in the LA protocols. I hadn't done movies here. I said, well, no, I really want to do the movie, Mel, but he says, then that's it. You're doing the movie. And finally, I get a call back from the studio saying, well, Mel was really pissed. He was angry. And he said, you're doing the movie. So we'll give you some support, but I really don't know how you're going to do it, but we'll see. Now it's an early prep, so there's plenty of time. 8 weeks before we're ready to start shooting the movie. So my wife drives me to the studio. I had a folding wheelchair. I went in, I go into my office there. I'm working on the board and the schedule and everything. And Mel comes in every day and we talk about the schedule and how we're going to do it. And the first full week of the schedule takes place in San Francisco. And we had scouted San Francisco. No, we hadn't yet. I'm sorry. We go up to he said, we went to San Francisco and we had to scout it, make sure we could do it. I'm on a wheelchair. We're going up hills. I got guys helping me. It was not easy. But I get back and we figured out how we're going to do the movie. And I'm back in LA. And because I had not dwelled on my leg and I didn't think about it, by the time we got late into prep and we were getting closer to shooting, I was out of the wheelchair. I had crutches, but I was moving around better, and I did the movie. And it was an extraordinary experience. The movie was fine. It didn't really affect the movie at all. We were, there wasn't a lot of running I had to do. I didn't have to do anything. I just had to be available and be around. And I had a great second assistant director working with me, and he helped me out to make sure I could do everything I had to do. Mel was completely on board. So there was nobody on the project that was bothering us. It was just the studio was very skeptical, but they stopped being skeptical after a certain point because we were getting the movie. We were shooting it. Everything worked. Everything was fine. We shot it in the amount of time. It was $3 million. It was 8 weeks, and we shot them. We started in San Francisco, which was a little difficult, but by that point I was on crutches and I could get around. And we weren't shooting on hills, but we just had hills to walk up at certain points, stuff like that. We were in the Fisherman's Wharf and different places Anyway, got back to LA. We're on stage for the rest of the movie. Everything worked out fine, and that was the end of it. As a result of this incident, I think Mel and I bonded because he was, not that we wouldn't have bonded anyway, but he had taken a stand and it worked. And he didn't like to be told, as I said, he never liked being told by somebody what he couldn't do. He liked being told what he could do, and if he thought he could do it, he didn't want someone telling him he couldn't. So I was the example of something that he put his foot down on for, and it worked. So we became friends. I mean, we during that period. He didn't have another movie. I went off right after that movie, and my leg had healed, and I went off and I did a movie with Stanley Donen. I did a movie called Movie was what it was released as, with George C. Scott, which is another whole series of stories. But in any event, I did that movie. Mel was editing his movie, and at the same time, his wife, Anne Bancroft, had written a script that for the AFI Women's Directing Workshop called Fatso. And it was a cute little short. And as I finished the movie with Stanley Donen, Mel called me up and said, would you consider helping Anne out? She's going to need somebody. And I was fine then. My legs were okay. He said, I'd like you to be the production manager on the movie, and we're going to try to. She wants to hire a lot of women. She wants to use, she's comfortable with women and crew. So, and that was the beginning of the next phase of my relationship. So I said, okay, sure. And I met Anne, and I had met Anne before. I liked her, and we got along great. And she wanted a female DP. There was maybe one in Hollywood, and I hired her. We had a female set decorator. We had a female, a lot of the key jobs. It was probably, to that point, the most female-centric movie crew you ever saw. We had a female electrician. We had just one, not a gaffer, but one of the electricians was a woman. We had women in major categories all through the movie that we could find, and my costume designer was a woman. All of that. So and I did that. I worked on that movie, and while I was on that movie, the Elephant Man script came to me through my babysitter. It's a crazy story.
Before the stage play, or was that?
Well, yes, it was before the stage play. I got the script, and I read the script, and my babysitter, I had two young sons, and she came to my house, and she was seeing with my kids, and she said at one point she knew I was in the movie business, and I was an AD, and I was working with Mel Brooks, and I was working with Anne Bancroft, and I had worked with Stanley Donen, and she knew all these names, and she said, would you mind reading my boyfriend's script? She said, he's a writer, he's trying to be a writer. He and his partner wrote a script, and so I said, sure, I'll read it. And I put it aside. And I went right after I got it, and before I had just finished Fatso, and I got a call from a friend of mine on the East Coast who said, there's this movie, The Brinks Job, that Billy Friedkin is directing, and they just fired the production manager. Billy hates the guy, and we need a new production manager. They had already crewed up. Everybody was there, but they hadn't started. They weren't going to be shooting for months. It was several months away, but it was a long prep. It was all in Boston. He said, would you be interested in being the production manager? So I said, sure, I'll do it. So I left that script. I didn't read it. I went, and I wound up getting the job, going to Boston, becoming the production manager on a Billy Friedkin film, which was another remarkable experience that at some time I will write about. But it was difficult. It was the middle of the winter, and I arrived. It was 1970. Let's see, it had to be 78, 77 or 78, I think, 78 maybe. It was it was the great blizzard of Boston. Until just a couple of years ago, it was the biggest blizzard they'd ever had in Boston. The crew was there. There were 3 to 4 feet of snow on the ground. The hotel had snow up to the first floor windows. Literally, there was a track from the airport when I got in with like walls of ice and snow all the way to things. So we weren't going to be shooting until March or April, but nevertheless, we couldn't do very much scouting in the middle of this snow. It was unbelievable amount of snow in New York City. Anyway, I took the job. I'm the production manager, and while we don't need to go into that whole story, at the end of it, I had gotten this script from these guys. I went back home and I picked it up, and this woman wasn't working for me anymore, but I found the script and I said, oh shit, I never read it. So I opened the script, I read it, and it was the Elephant. Writers were Chris DeVore and Eric Berggren. They had written the script, and they are those guys, Chris DeVore, Eric Berggren. They wrote the script. I loved the script, but it was a tough story, and it was a period, and it was in London, and it was, but I didn't have any preconceptions about what it took to make a movie yet. I was still young. I was still working on whatever movies were out there. I didn't think about the commercial quality of it at the time, and I really liked it. So I wound up, had their numbers. I called them up and I said, come over to my house. They did. We talked. I said, look, I love your script. I think it's terrific. I said, I'm an assistant director, production manager, but I want to be a producer, and I think I could produce this, and I would really like to take a shot at it, but I need to get an option from you. So they were thrilled that somebody had read their stuff. They weren't in any guilds. They literally were just had jobs in California. They had come out of San Francisco. I think they went to school in San Francisco. And they said, sure. So I paid them $1,000, which was a huge amount of money for me, as an option on their screenplay. And I said, at a purchase price of, I think it was $50,000, which I knew I wouldn't pay.
How much time did you have on the option?
I had a year. And maybe it was renewable for a second year. I'm not actually sure, but I think it was certainly for a year. Anyway, the meantime, I am working with, Mel had called me, and I may have the dates wrong. I think I might have gone to the Brinks job before I did Fatso, but he had called me up to do Fatso, so I was still talking to him. And when we finished Fatso, which I was, as I said, I was a production manager on, I had to go to New York to scout a couple of days. We were going to shoot in New York. Ann and I were going to shoot just some backgrounds, because we shot the whole movie here in LA, but it was supposed to be in Little Italy in New York. So we had to find a couple of shots that we could get that would convince an audience that we were in New York. So while I'm in New York, I get a call from Mel in New York, and he says, hey, I just read the script that was on your, my associate's desk, and it's called The Elephant Man. What do you know about it? And I said, well, I optioned it. He says, you optioned it? I said, yeah, I own it. He says, well, when you get back to LA, give me a call. Let's get together. I'd like to talk to you about it. I come in when I'm back, and now Fatso's basically over anyway. And he says, look, I'm thinking of starting a company to make movies other than my own comedies. And I really think this is a terrific story, and I'd love to do it. You can produce it. I know you know how to produce. I mean, I know you're good. I've watched you. You've done stuff with my wife and with me, and I have total faith in you. So you're the producer. He said, but I'd like to help finance it. At the time, I had taken the script to a couple of studios through very junior employees that I might have known, to see if I could get somebody to look at it. But nobody really looked at it. And when I thought about it, I realized, it wasn't black and white at the point, but a story about a deformed man in Victorian England, pretty unlikely that any American studio is going to pick that up when they're making, Mel Brooks comedies and soon to make Star Wars. But there's not a lot of, there's not a lot of room for this kind of movie as a dramatic feature. So Mel calls me and he says, look, here's what I'll do. He says, why don't you get your lawyer and I'll get my lawyer. We'll sit together and we'll talk about how we can make this movie. What do you think it's going to cost? So I ballparked it in my mind just from what I knew from budgets and stuff that I'd done at that point, and I gave him a pretty low number. I said, I don't know, about $3 million, $3.5 million, something like that. So he said, okay. He said, let's talk about it. So we get in, and I meet with his lawyer, and he says, I'd like to make this as the first movie with my new company. The company's, we're going to call the company Brooks Films. His previous company that made all of his comedies was Crossbow Productions. But he said, I want to separate this because this is not my comedies. So let's call it Brooks Films. We'll use that name for any movies that we make that are not my comedies. And you can produce this movie. I'm fine with that. And here's the deal. I'm going to raise the money, and the original deal was he would give me, he would have 75% ownership, and I would have 25% ownership. And that my ownership would be diminishable, could be made less by money that would have to be given to actors and things like that, but that it would be what they call in the business a hard floor of 20 points. There's 20 points. You have a hard floor of 20 points. And if you're interested in that deal, we'll do the paperwork. We'll get it done. I'm the studio. Brooks Films will be the studio. We're not going to do this with a major studio. He says we're going to pitch it to major studios, but my interest is not to have the major studios own it. I want to own it.
And he wanted to raise the money
and he
for
said,
production outside of
well, he said he would raise it from the studios, but not as an ownership interest. He would try to
like
get them either a distribution deal, make a distribution deal with them, get some money from them for that, because he felt the money was low enough when I said what I thought it would cost, which was literally out of my ass. I mean, I don't know what I was thinking, but that's what I said. And he said, no, I think I can raise that kind of money, and if I get a distribution deal that's worth $1 million, that defrays some of the cost. We'll do this, And you got to remember, this is 1979, early 1979, not early, mid 79. Okay, I was astounded. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't have anything. I called somebody. I found somebody to be a lawyer for me. He had a lawyer. My lawyers started talking to his lawyer and about creating a contract for me. And he said, okay, we made a deal based on I would get paid X. I would get a deferment if the movie, basically broke even. I would get a deferment before there were any profits, and I would get profits. Now, as I told you, the original profit deal was a floor of 20%. During the course of this little time, Mel reconsidered. He told his lawyer, at least I heard this from his lawyer, and his lawyer is still a good friend of mine, and so is Mel. But his lawyer said, Mel thought, this is your first movie, and you haven't produced a movie before, even though we know you're good, we know you know how to do it, but he thinks 20% is really very, very rich deal for you. And so he would he's not changing your fee or your deferment, but he'd rather make it, he said he is demanding that your back-end participation will be 10%. And in a funny kind of a way, I had gone from the high of thinking I had this amazing deal to a low of thinking, geez, I'm getting completely beat up And I haven't even, and I found the script,
Yeah.
and I found the guys and all of that. So I spoke to my lawyer, who wasn't sure whether we should accept it, but ultimately I talked to my wife, and I said, "Look, what do you think?" I said, "Look, I'm here, and I have an opportunity to make a movie. I have somebody who claims they can finance it, and I believe they have the resources, because he was as hot as it could be at that time. I mean, Mel was the biggest comedy person in the world. He was making movies, and studios were funding all of his movies. He had done Young Frankenstein. He had done all these, big movies. So she said, "Well, you have two choices. You can either say no and run the risk of having it fall apart, or you can say yes. But if you say yes, you must forget it. Forget the whole experience. Just accept the fact that that's the deal. Make the movie, and you never have to mention it again. It's over. It's over. I mean, but if you're going to let it eat you up, don't do it." And it was very good advice. It was really good advice, because I thought, well, I really want to make this movie, and I really, really, really have an inclination that I can do this. And I don't want to, I mean, he's a businessman and I'm not, and I don't want to fight over the details. So if the movie isn't successful, it won't matter. And if the movie is successful, I'll make some money anyway. So I said yes, and that was the end of it. That was the deal. I accepted the deal, and I went on to start making the movie. And from that point on, it was as good a situation as I could have imagined, without knowing what normal movie deals are like, because I'd never done it before. But it was my first movie, and I knew I was going to make it I wanted to make it in London. I knew I wanted to make it with English actors. The story of David Lynch's involvement was pretty remarkable in itself, but it really wasn't the first thing that happened. I mean, David came onto the picture after Mel had already agreed to fund it. And by the way, when he said he would fund it, he said, "We're going to take it around to every studio. We're going to ask them for money, but they're going to be surprised, because we're going to not ask them to fund it. We're just going to ask them for a distribution deal with a guarantee. That's it. And then we will use that to get other deals, but they're not going to own it." So he said, "So your points are going to be much more meaningful than they would if the studio took over the picture and totally funded it. And even if they gave you more points, those points will be worthless, because they're going to charge it against all of their overhead and all kinds of things. And I won't." He said, when I say 10%, I mean 10% of every dollar that comes into my company from that movie, you will get 10 cents. So it sounded good. And to this day, that's what happened. I mean, he did exactly what he said. I still get checks every year, and not for huge amounts of money. But when I say not huge,
on Netflix. Right?
It's on Netflix. Yeah. I'll get a check for $10,000 or $15,000 or even $30,000 in a given year, coming from that 10% that I have had since 1979. The other aspect of that is the fact that I've made a lot of movies since then. It has been the most successful, transparent deal I've ever made, because I've never made the amount of profits on any other movie that I made on that very first movie, because I was not dealing with studio accounting practices. I was just dealing with Mel's personal accountant, and every time he gets money that comes in from foreign sales or from cassettes or whatever, I get a phone call, I see what the total check is, and I get 10% of it. And that's been the way it's been from 30 years. So I mean, I understand. Mel is a tough businessman. He doesn't make easy deals with anybody, but he stands by his deals, and I respect him for it. And I So I made the right decision, is really what I'm saying as far as that goes. It was, for me, it was absolutely the right decision. And I maintained a very, very positive relationship with Mel, which enabled me to make several movies with him over the course of my career. I did Francis with Mel, with Jessica Lange. I did a movie called The Doctor and the Devils with Mel. I did The Producers, the musical, and that was another situation where I went to him after I saw the play on Broadway, and I said, Mel, if you make this into a movie from the musical, I have to produce it. And he says, yeah, we'll produce it together. So we've been friends for 30-odd years, and it started from when I was his AD, but it has continued. And one of the other good things I would say about him is that, unlike many of the other people in this business who I've worked with, who tend to look at you as the first job you worked with them on, he tends to look at you in terms of the last job you worked with them. So he respects me as a producer. He doesn't think of me as the AD who became a producer, that he made a producer, which is maybe a small distinction, but it actually means a lot, because when I'm out with Mel and I'm introduced to people by him, he always introduces me as the producer of The Elephant Man or the producer of this, and it is, for my own self-esteem, it's a good thing. On the other hand, I've been with other people who say, oh, he was my production assistant on such and such a movie, because it's there to their benefit to say that they knew me when I was not in a position to do anything. So I have, to this day, I have a tremendously high regard for Mel. He was one of the best people I ever worked with, and he was fun to work with as a director, even when I was an AD, because his comedy is a comedy that I'm close to, I like, and he is, unlike many comedians who tend to be very dark when they're not on, he is always effusive, always willing to sign autographs, meet people anywhere, anyhow, and it's just the nature of who he is, and that's kind of a nice thing. I mean, I'm not disparaging other comics. I mean, but I know people like Steve Martin. He's a wonderful comedian, but you wouldn't want to approach him when he's sitting alone in a room, because he's very reclusive and very quiet and very dark. Nathan Lane, beautiful, phenomenal actor, but it has a very dark side, and he's insecure and outside of his ability as a comedian. So Mel is not like that. He has full knowledge of who he is, and he exploits it to the fullest, and I have a great deal of respect for it.